Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Laverton. Welcome to Conversing. What a joy it is today to welcome Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Thompson as our guest on Conversing. Jacqueline Thompson is the senior pastor of the Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, California. When she was elected in 2019 as the senior pastor of the church, she was the first woman called in the African American Baptist Church to be a senior pastor since the church was founded in 1919. So for over 100 years, there's been no women who were in senior pastor roles, but she was the first one elected. Before that, she had served as the assistant pastor at Allen Temple, as the youth pastor, and at Shiloh Baptist Church of Washington, D.C. She has a BA from the University of California, Berkeley in political economics, a Master of Divinity from Howard University School of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry in African American Church Leadership from Fuller Theological Seminary, and she is a member of the NAACP and of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. My experiences with her have really been primarily actually at Allen Temple Baptist Church, where I love to go and worship and hear her preach. Her voice, her wisdom, her groundedness, her humility, and her courage and boldness combined to make her a remarkable communicator and leader. I'm so thankful that we get to have her here on Conversing. Pastor Jackie, what a great gift to welcome you today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Finally.
Yes, we've been working at this and finally it's happened. So I'm just really delighted. You know, you grew up in Oakland, California, a place with all kinds of reputational pieces to it and lots of people understanding it or thinking they understand it from a distance. Those of us who live in the East Bay have a much clearer picture. You having been raised in Oakland and serving now as a pastor in Logan in the church that you were raised in. Those are all pieces that I want us to explore. But let's start really with Oakland and your being born and raised into a family by a single mom who you and she attended Allen Temple. We'll come to that part of the story.
Yeah.
What do you remember about how would you have described Oakland as a little girl?
Oakland as a little girl. I loved Oakland as a little girl. It was a place where there was family because my mother's siblings had moved here from Louisiana. Nice. And so we had a very tight-knit community. We had a very tight-knit neighborhood. I grew up in deep East Oakland, as we call it, which is above seminary. Working class families and I grew up during a time where you still played outside, right, until the street lights came on, once you finished your homework. And you were able to connect with other kids that were on the block and around the corner. And so it was a very idyllic upbringing for me. I did not come to know that my city was challenged in ways that, people who are not in our area probably know better until I was in a class at Berkeley. And so I got into UC Berkeley, right? All these non-traditional things that are happening. I took a sociology class in the summer. And I remember the professor describing this area of Oakland called the Killing Zone. And she said the Killing Zone was considered from Seminary Avenue. These streets may not have any meaning for your listeners, but for us, Seminary, until about 98th or maybe 100th or so. And in class, I said, I live there. I grew up there, right? And so I began to see a different side of Oakland, that you knew partially from experience.
Yes.
But I kind of feel I grew up very protected. I knew that there were issues, but they were not issues that caused us to live in fear. Or to see our neighbors as our enemies.
Right.
It was just I would think in my reflection, just all of the challenges that come with being in an urban context.
Right.
And so once I realized that there was actually a designation for that area, right? And I wasn't the only one. There were several of us that were in that class that had grown up in Oakland. Then it kind of caused me to look at, why is that? Mm-hmm. So part of what I ended up majoring in Berkeley had to do with studying the dynamics of wealth and power and how that influences how communities are shaped and formed locally
political economics,
and globally.
Is that right?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Political economics. And so that was the key figure. But I remember the Oakland that embraced small businesses. I remember the Oakland, that was full of grocery stores and community events and church fellowships, 3 p.m. services. And then, of course, everything that comes with being in the extended Bay Area. It really was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me.
Wow. So when you had that experience at Cal, I can imagine you maybe soon after that calling your mom and saying, did you know that we live in the kill zone?
Exactly.
What,
I probably talked about it for the remainder of the year. Like, why didn't you tell me? What have you all been doing? What have you all been doing?
Amazing.
Yeah. But it was certainly... And it also kind of pointed out and highlighted that there was a really big difference in how we look at something and describe it and how the people who experience it describe it themselves.
Yes, right.
And so I understand from a sociological perspective and researchers and all of that, based on what you're looking for, that's how you see it. But if you were to ask the people, like the great, tremendous people who still would go fishing and bring fish to their neighbors if they caught a lot, that's the community that we were. They would not describe it that way at all.
Wow.
And so it began to open my eyes on really marked differences, right? In identity, not just in personhood, but again in communities.
Right. Just for the sake of our listeners, the kill zone, as the name would suggest, is a part of Oakland, which is basically an area which has the highest concentration of homicides. Mm-hmm. And I believe it still does have the highest concentration of homicides. Mm-hmm. But to live inside that and to grow up in that context, as you say, is something very different than simply the sociological or demographic statistics would lead you to think. That's just that is, we could have our whole conversation just on that. That is really a fascinating thing.
And the idea that I grew up feeling protected, right? And covered, and neighbors looked out for each other. You were accountable to everybody. I grew up in does your mother know you're outside? I'm going to tell your mother, right? And being as a part of a faith community in the church was a big part of that as well. Right.
Mm-hmm. So you're being raised by your mom, and you are from an early stage, you're part of Allen Temple, or really the whole of your life?
Well, not really. So my father's a pastor. Uh-huh. And he pastored a church in Berkeley called Berkeley Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church. He pastored 40 years. Yes. And so I spent a lot of my early childhood kind of bouncing between Berkeley Mount Zion, and my mother was a member of a church called Cornerstone. So from the time of my birth until about 12, that's where I went. And so I'm appreciative because right around 12 was when I got antsy and did not understand all of these long services and did not understand, a lot of what was taking place that had become tradition, some tied to scripture, some cultural, a lot of it not either, right? And I told my mother I just didn't want to go anymore. I did not want to go. I don't understand it. And, at that point, you begin to see the differences in certain neighborhoods and landscapes, and you begin to wonder, well, if God loves us, why, right? And so I think that happens for all of us, not just as children, even as adults.
Sure.
And so my mother made literally, I just think, the most selfless decision that really just changed the trajectory of my life. And so when I expressed to her, I don't like this, I don't want to do this, she could have had the strong arm, because she was a strong arm mother, and said, no, you have to go. But we started visiting. And so at 12 years old, we started visiting all kinds of churches in Oakland, right? So I've been to every church just about. Storefront, larger church, everyone. But one Sunday we landed in the balcony, and I didn't learn until I got older that my mother had previously been a member of Allen Temple before my birth.
Right.
But we landed in the balcony of Allen Temple, and this little short man with this little African funny looking hat on mounted this pulpit with the huge pulpit that you had to ascend these stairs to climb. And so to me, his eyes were equal with me in the balcony, right?
Yes.
And I will never forget it. He preached Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, and his entire sermon basically was my premise that we don't just come here to come here, that our faith is supposed to mean something, that our lives are supposed to make a contribution. And I remember being completely enamored. So much so, I walked down the aisle. They said my mother was kind of trotting behind me because when the invitation was extended or the opening of the doors of the church, as we say, I shot out the balcony. I was like, I'm in. This is it. Let's go. And so I didn't know my mother was there. She wasn't there. It wasn't a group decision.
Right.
And so I walked down the aisle and she followed behind me. And so from 12 years old on, I was a member of Allen Temple Baptist Church with no indication that it would literally serve as the foundation that would shape the trajectory of my life or that I would land back there full circle in this capacity.
I love knowing those details. The pastor you're referring to, of course, is Dr. J. Alfred Smith, who is just one of the most beloved, heralded African-American pastors in the United States and is now retired, but for decades served this church that is a congregation that's been in existence for 100 years or approximately 100 years.
This year, we are 105 years old.
Wow.
Founded in 1919, and he served us as pastor for 40 years.
Wow. So you had been having a certain amount of restlessness in your own spiritual life and beginning to see the horizons of the world that were around you. And you now lock into Allen Temple. Mm-hmm. What happened to that restlessness as those two things converged? Do you have a restlessness about?
Well, I think that stage of the restlessness began to subside a bit because I was active. And so Allen Temple, part of the attraction, I think, and comfort from my mother was Allen Temple had a strong youth ministry.
Yes.
And so I think part of that insulation and safety and protection I felt was because I was able to go there. And they had a place for us. So when I got out of school, if my mother was still working, I would just go to Allen Temple. Right? And there was always going to be someone there, who would look out for you or give you something to do, make these copies, lick these envelopes, whatever was going on. And so it began to subside. But in the same way, with the kind of preaching, as you know, we're very social justice based.
Yes.
And Dr. J. Alfred Smith is a master in that regard.
Yes.
In addition to being able to hear voices from all across the nation of similar biblical viewpoint, then the kind of unsettledness or restlessness came with, how do we expand this message? How do we get everybody involved? How do we get them to feel this way as well? Yes. And so that's probably kind of when the call came after college, but through high school and through first part of college, that it has subsided.
Yeah, amazing. So you go to Berkeley, and as you're at Berkeley, do you continue worshiping all during those years at Allen Temple?
I do not. I do what all college kids do, right? And so I could not go away to school. That was what the deal I made with my mother, but she would let me stay on campus. So I stayed in the dorm.
Nice.
And so I did what all college kids do. We fall off. We're just so happy that we don't have to be anywhere every Sunday. We're going to get pizza. Right. We're going to hang out. And, and my mother made threats, as, all parents do, or, you really need to. Yes. And so we graduated from that to, they gave you a scholarship.
Yes.
You owe them. Yes. And so I had been promising her that I would come. But the other thing that happens, which I think can happen in the life of churches, historic churches, is while we had a strong youth ministry, not so much young adult ministry. Because many of our young people would graduate, they would go away to school. Mm-hmm. But kind of that catch-all for the young adults, that 18 to 21, 18 to 23 group that stays around, not so much, right? And so I remember just the power of a pastor. I showed up that Sunday after duress from my mother, under duress. I'm there in the narthex at the 8 a.m. service. And Dr. Smith said, Jackie, and it always amazed me with so many members that he even knew my name. I miss your voice in the choir. And I just kind of smiled and nod. And he said, where are you? And I said, well, there's nothing really for me to do. And what do we need to do? And look, this is literally in the narthex as he's waiting to process in. And I said, well, we need a choir for young adults. Start it. Right? Because that's who he was. was.
Oh
He
my
absolutely
gosh.
was. And so I said, oh, dang, what have you done? But either way, we started a ministry for young adults. And
Right.
that became my work while I was in the tail end of college, founding that choir that still exists today. Although we may have to look at some of the age of the members. Hopefully they were not still in there, right, from those years ago. But I became the founder and leader of a young adult ministry at Allen Temple Baptist Church. And so I was able to reach out to those who were kind of feeling how I was, particularly those who may not have gone to college, but didn't feel a place. So that's how that kind of came about.
Amazing. I just want to underscore again, because I want to talk about how amazing your own call to Allen Temple is, and we'll come to that in a minute. But in order to really understand and appreciate that, I want to underscore how truly remarkable the ministry of Allen Temple has been for these many, many decades, and the prominence of J. Alfred Smith for the decades that he was a pastor. He's just a towering Oakland influence during the civil rights era, during so many enormously challenging seasons. Just absolutely an outspoken, fine, careful, thoughtful, passionate, devoted, deeply spiritually grounded man, an amazing, amazing person. And so for him to do that kind of spark plug moment in the narthex feels completely consistent with what I know of him. I remember I was first living in Berkeley in the 80s, and I used to periodically worship at Allen Temple just because I wanted the nourishment of his preaching. I wanted the nourishment of being in a Black context. I wanted the nourishment of being in a congregation that took society, culture, and the social realities and injustices with the full seriousness. I remember the very first time being reminded, and I'd only periodically had this experience, but Allen Temple was kind of the quintessence of it. It was like the whole universe belonged to worship at Allen Temple, because God was absolutely central and primary, and the person and action, point of action that held everything together. And then you had this galaxy of every kind of life experience that was being represented, talked about, honored, celebrated, from children to all generations and ages, but also
and women, because during that time,
incredible.
It was rare. We were one of the few.
Yes, I was going to say, very strongly affirming women in leadership in a number of different ways, and people in different kinds of social need, from people who were recently incarcerated to people who were unemployed, to people who were in circumstances of other kinds of family challenges or social challenges or racial challenges, whatever it might be. And all of it was part of the feast that worship was and is actually at Allen Temple. So I want listeners to imagine that feast every Sunday in a defining congregation. There's a number of very prominent Black congregations in Oakland, but there's no doubt that Allen Temple has a very unique place. And it has had an enormous, I would say, even outsized influence in the whole nature and culture of Oakland, as well as in the church scene. So you become the first female assistant pastor in time after you've done your theological training. Then you are brought in as the first women assistant pastor. Did that feel as full of all the implications and challenges that might imply?
It did not, for a number of reasons. One, I had gone to seminary, Howard University, graduated, was on staff at Shiloh Baptist Church in D.C., where I actually just preached Sunday.
Oh, no,
their
nice,
161st anniversary. So that was a good reunion. But one, pastoring was never something that I wanted to do. That wasn't kind of on my list of things to do. I'm much more the itinerant evangelist. I embraced that. And I loved the East Coast. I loved D.C. And so I never saw myself coming back. But what happened was life, right? And family. And so my mother, that same beloved mother, began experiencing memory issues. And so we had seen it as a family, but as you may know, and as I'm sure as your listeners have experienced, if they are at that stage, you can't tell someone with memory issues that they're having memory issues, right? Like that's a big fight.
Right.
And so my mother had always wanted me to move home. Oh, mom. And I had even investigated how to move her. But she called me one day, and she's a very dignified, prideful Black woman. And she called me, and I said, "Hey, Ma." And she said, "Hey." And she said, "All right, I want to talk to you. When are you coming home?" That's the usual opener. Right?
Yes.
And I just said, "Oh, Ma." And she said, "No, Jackie, I really need you to come home." And then she said, "Before I don't recognize you anymore."
Wow.
And that
Wow.
was the first time that she had ever acknowledged that even she knew something was happening.
Right.
So that was 2009. And I literally made the decision, I'm going to move home, but it was to take care of my mother.
Right.
It was not, in my mind, I was going to shift my itinerant ministry from the East Coast to the West Coast.
Yes.
I would come, make sure she was set up, fly out of the Oakland or San Francisco airport, preach,
Yes.
do revivals, come back. Allen Temple, pastoring, none of that was on my radar. But as the Lord would have it, in 2009, J. Alfred Smith Sr. had retired. And the church had elected his son, Dr. J. Alfred Smith Jr. In 2009 was his first year.
Got it.
And so he had asked me to come do a revival at Allen Temple. And while I was there, he said, "Hey, I heard you're moving home," right? So I don't know how, but he said, "If that's true, would you consider serving with me at Allen Temple as assistant pastor?" He said,
Wow.
"I could use your support."
Hmm.
And so I said, "Well, my goodness, the Lord is so funny, just full of jokes, full of
Yes.
surprises."
Yes.
But I did it. I accepted because I said, all of who I am at this point, I got at this church. And so if there was something that I had that they felt that I could contribute, absolutely 100%. And so I said yes, but I didn't, the first woman, the historic mark of it, what it would mean for the Bay, none of that was on my mind. I was just
Right.
like, hey, right, I have a full-time job. I can take care of my mama. That's
Right.
what
That sounds
I
like a
was
good
thinking.
combination. Yeah, right.
And
Got it.
then once it happened, because uniquely, I had an installation. And apparently it is rare for assistant pastors of any gender to have an installation in the nation. So that was the first, like, okay, something's going on here.
Yes,
You have a
right.
responsibility.
Right.
And then we began to see other churches who had never previously called women start considering and hiring women on their
Wow.
staff. And so that is when I began to realize, okay, just your presence has done something
Right.
for this area.
Right. Right. And you served in that role how many years before you became the senior
I
pastor?
was assistant pastor. I
About
started
10?
officially in 2010 until 2019.
Yeah. So,
So 9 years.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So did it seem to you when it came time for there to be a new pastor appointed, did it seem obvious to you that this might be you, or was it even really in your thinking? I mean, there had never been a woman senior pastor of a major Black church.
No, because, as Baptist churches, we had a process. And so
Right.
you had to find a search committee, and they opened it up, and people all over the nation applied. I wasn't even
Right.
going to apply because, remember, this
Yes.
wasn't on my list of things to do, right?
Right.
I checked all my journals. But the members began to come to me.
Yes. Yes.
And the people began to say, "We hope you consider." And you smile and say, "Oh, thank you so much. You're kind." And then it moved from that to, "Did you apply?" Right?
Yes.
Have you,
Yes.
what's going
Yes.
on? And so, of course, I was certainly flattered by their affirmation,
Yes.
the idea that
Sure.
they thought you were the person for it. But I applied because I told a deacon that I would.
Yes.
He asked me point blank. I had to tell him, "Well, sir, no. You better apply." And so
Right.
I said, "I promise you, I will." So I applied. I hate to say it, it'll be a secret between us and your entire audience wherever it flows. I applied the last day. It was due maybe 10 o'clock at night. So I was the one at 8:30 scrambling to do it. And not because I didn't think it was a worthy pursuit, but again, we all kind of have our own ideas of how we see ourselves and the trajectories that we have for ourselves. And sometimes we just want God to bless what we say
Yes.
that we want to
Yes.
do.
Yes.
But I just didn't see it. And there was probably a part of me, Mark, if I'm honest, that wondered, could I? Because there was only one example of a female senior pastor in our area of a Black church. And that was a woman by the name of Bishop Ernestine Cleveland Reeves at the Center of Hope, the only one.
Right.
I had seen associate ministers, on our staff, of course.
Sure.
And we had staff clergy who were women, ministers, and female. But to be the senior authority, right, where there's no one you have to consult, there's no one you have to ask, there's no meeting you need to call, was something that I had not seen here. So I think there was a piece of me that wondered, are you called to this? Because I'm one that believes that the call to ministry, the call to preach, the call to pastor are very distinct experiences.
Yes.
That
yes.
It's not just a kind of a track with no boundaries that you kind of roll into. That the call to shepherd God's people is very different than the call to declare the word.
Right.
And so I think I may have struggled with that a bit, but I turned it in, and as they say, the rest is history.
Amazing. Well, I was living then, my wife and I were living in Pasadena, so I was aware from a distance that the transition had happened, and I was happy that it had happened, but we didn't know one another at that stage. And over the years that I was at Fuller, and then coming back and forth between the Bay Area and Southern California, and then since moving back to the Bay Area, worshiping in Allen Temple and getting to know you has been really one of my great joys. And I'm so aware that your call to Allen Temple feels to me so fitting, so powerful, so well placed. Like, surely, this is definitely what God has been intending because of who you are, because of how you preach, because of how you lead, because of your comfort level in your own person, your capacity to lead out of every part of you that I can at least see registered in your preaching and in your leadership. And the ease and naturalness with which you do that is very freeing, I would think, to the congregation to not
Thank you.
To not feel as though, somehow the congregation has to work with the pastor to come to accept them. That I don't have any sense of that.
We have a love relationship.
Yes,
that we do have. I'm blessed in that regard.
Yeah, it's really quite wonderful. So you take on this responsibility, which is just so enormous and so important in the Bay Area. The thought of Allen Temple not being on the scene in Oakland would be a multicultural hit for the Bay Area on all kinds of levels. And I think it means, at least as I look at you in your role, that the role that you occupy and the role of Allen Temple more broadly is one that is really of particular critical importance to the well-being of the Bay Area. Not because, of course, you're controlling all the levers and blah, blah, blah. I'm sure that it doesn't feel that way at all when you're in your role. And at the same time, I'm sure it's clear to you why I'm saying what I'm saying and why the stature of the church, the stature of the predecessors, the stature of the ministry of Allen Temple and your leadership, which is so critical at this moment, just makes a mark that is needed and very, very, very positive. I'm curious, let's imagine you're at one of the higher peaks of the hills that surround Oakland, and you're looking down over Oakland, maybe a little bit like Jesus looking down over Jerusalem, let's just pretend, and you're trying to just inhale all that's there, all that you're seeing, and the longer you're the pastor, the more you have insight into so many elements inside the church and outside the church. Take us on a little mind tour of what you see, what you feel, what you breathe in, what causes you to clench up and what causes you to just celebrate and rejoice and wonder about.
Well, if I'm standing, let's say, at Merritt College,
okay,
and I'm looking down, there is always celebration. One, because I think celebration is an act of resistance, right? Joy is an act of resistance. But Oakland, as I say, and I've said it a million times and it's still true today, for me is a tale of two cities.
Mm-hmm.
It has always been a city where, not east and west as most people would think of, but we are a hills, flatlands city.
Yes.
And so your experience in the areas of the city where there are hills and there are communities of the hills is very different than your experience if you are in the flatlands. And that is heightened based on whether you are east or west or by the lake or, how it's divided.
Right.
And I think what makes me tense up most and clench up most, because again, I spent 15 years away from here,
right,
is the growing disparity
yes,
between the haves and the have-nots that has
right,
occurred during the time that I was away and
yes,
has increased a bit since I've been back, because I'm also coming up on my 15th year being back home, right? And so that continues to challenge me in ways that makes me uncomfortable, that make me angry, but that also kind of serve as fuel for the fire.
Right.
There seems to be disparity in the attention that is given to certain parts of the city. There is disparity in the access by different persons based on your zip code. There are even health outcomes
right,
that are able to be determined based on your zip code.
right,
Decisions that are made that impact the city as a whole based on your zip code.
right.
And that killing zone statement has never left me. And I know so many of us who are products of those zip codes, who God has blessed to go on to do amazing things.
Yes, yes.
But it was because of the quality of life that was present within that community.
Right.
And
right.
so that is what fuels me to fight for the persons I believe are marginalized, to give voice to those who have no voice,
right,
and to shift the narrative. Right?
Right.
And so, as I said, I recognize, and it still is today, violence remains an issue for the entire city. But that is not the full narrative.
Right, right.
But
Absolutely.
sometimes we become a party just to the statistical reflection, not understanding there are people behind those statistical numbers.
Right,
Right?
right.
And so just as there may be a single mother who has lost her son or her daughter to the hand of violence, she's also a woman that's raising 2 or 3 other children in that same community, healthy, then they're playing sports. And there are so many other pictures that are often lost.
Right, right.
And so that's often what you hear, in my preaching is, I believe, part of our responsibility, particularly at Allen Temple, but not just Allen Temple, as people of faith, as people who say that we are followers of the way and that we believe in Jesus, that we call power structures to account.
Right, right.
And call power structures to understand that there is a bigger vision and to fight for that vision of the kingdom of God where there is enough for everybody.
Right, right.
To not allow, as Walter Brueggemann talks about, the numbness that can come with royal consciousness, to not allow that numbness to take effect in our lives, to not continue to build freeways so we don't see the pain and the suffering in certain parts of the city, to not, limit. I appreciate the fact that you come to worship. I know what you pass and what you see, but it's important for us to remain connected really to the epicenter of people's pain, because for me, my reading of the gospel, that's where Jesus lived.
Right.
You always found him at the epicenter of somebody's need. Whether the need was healing, whether the need was hunger, whether the need, was some kind of equity, he was right there.
Right.
And so for me, that is where God has called us to. Now, I have wonderful friends in the hills, right? And I appreciate hills folks. But I want the same access, the same attention, the same quality of internet, the same lack of a break in electricity. I want all of that for the people in the flatlands who had no choice.
Right.
To the socioeconomic class that they were born into.
Right, right. I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. Just so that people can picture coming to Allen Temple, you do drive along some of the streets of Oakland, which just visibly shows some of the greatest pain, poverty, chaos, really, of people's lives, the brokenness. And it is, to me, almost like a cultural prelude to worship that feels like if what we're doing in worship isn't in some way engaging in this reality, then what are we actually really doing in the larger picture?
Yeah.
And because you get to Allen Temple and then you don't block out the streets around Allen Temple, you bring the streets vividly to mind as you worship in Allen Temple, conscious of a God who walks in those places of pain and suffering and chaos, and calls this church and other churches and people of faith more broadly to really see and respond and engage is very, very powerful. And it must be part of the challenge of the congregation, because the congregation itself is a hills and flatlands congregation.
It is. It is.
So what do people in Allen Temple who maybe lived in the flatlands at one stage, but are now hill people, I'll call them, how do they talk about Allen Temple's engagement with all of Oakland?
I think the people who are members of Allen Temple are proud. I think we have a lot of members who are blessed, as I am, to know that what we've seen today and what we kind of currently see was not the only picture.
Right.
Right? It's the reason why Joshua, when they were entering into crossing the Jordan, where he said, go get those 12 stones, because we need to build a memorial. So when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? So for many of our members, that's what Allen Temple is. We are a memorial that can point back to the story and say, no, this was not always Jericho Road.
Yes.
This was not always a road of poverty and pain, that there were small businesses here. There were stores here. There were banks here. We were just as viable as other parts of the community. And so I do think that they certainly feel a commitment to the charity aspect that has increased as a result. So they're going to feed the homeless. We're going to have COVID testing and vaccination. We're going to make sure those who don't have access to the basic needs. But we are also committed to the justice aspect of it, right? We love the Good Samaritan on the Jericho Road, but I want to know, why is that particular road filled with robbers?
Right.
And while the other roads or other paths that can be taken are not, right? And so I think the hills folks who were once flatland folks are actually some of the best folks.
Yeah.
Because it is easier for them to embrace a vision that when they leave the parking lot, they don't quite see yet.
Right.
But because they've seen it before, and they believe in a God who is able to do everything, they are eager and committed to work to bring that vision to pass.
Mm. You know, one of the things that has been difficult in Oakland's history in the decades that I've known more of it, has been the undulation. There have been seasons where it's felt like Oakland was really on the rise, that there was a kind of gathering of economic support, there was a gathering of political will, there was a gathering of social imagination that felt like, okay, this is a long road. Nobody thinks this is a simple task, but there's more aligned than there used to be. And this all seems really like it carries a great deal of hope. And then stuff happens, and it often feels as though it falls apart. The coalitions that once were there are gone, or the politicians are no longer in place, or the money dries up, or whatever it might be. So I guess, you know, I feel the power of exactly what you're saying and the authenticity of the witness. But I would think one of the leadership challenges of being at Allen Temple is that you ride these currents that are part of Oakland's ups and downs that I would think would make galvanizing a community to press forward all the more important, but also filled with its own particular challenges. Now, from what you've just said, maybe that's not as true as I might imagine. So how do you ride that undulation?
Well, I think my experience at Shiloh in D.C. helped with that, right? So my time in D.C., in Washington, D.C., and for those, if you've never lived there, I will say, even if you visit a couple times, you can feel that it's a power center of the world.
Yes.
But when you live there, you engage people from all walks of life, but somehow it's always connected, right, to that power center. So part of what I did after my time as a youth pastor at Shiloh is I was executive director of the church's nonprofit.
Right.
And so I would write grants and fund programs. We had Teen Mothers program. We had HIV/AIDS program. We had a daycare center. So all of these things you have to manage, keep up and running. But being in a capacity as an executive director, you are forced to build coalition and partnership. There is absolutely no way to get anything done right? In the District of Columbia. If you don't know how to build collaboration and partnership, and oftentimes in situations where you all may not land on the same issues on the same side.
Yes.
But there was a phrase that I learned in the nonprofit world that I have carried over because I think it's a true statement. And I also think it speaks to your observations around what has happened in city politics and, the ups and downs, ebbs and flows of the city. And that is, people would say to me, remember, there are no permanent friends. There are no permanent enemies. They're just permanent interests.
Wow.
And so what that taught me is that the players around the table will change.
Yes.
As long as the interest in the center of the table stays the same, it does not matter how the players change.
Yes.
Part of what I think we are faced with, and I think Oakland might just be a microcosm for lots of urban cities, with our issues and challenges, is that we allow interest to change.
Yes.
Oakland had always been a city that was deeply concerned with the collective.
Right.
There was a pride in saying you were from Oakland, right?
Yes,
it didn't matter what part, what side.
Right.
And people would say, oh, the Bay Area, San Francisco. No. Oakland, right?
Oakland, exactly.
That's why we were so hurt with the Warriors and we were so hurt with the Raiders, and now we're devastated by the A's. But I think the temptation, and again, in case you didn't know, Bergman is one of my favorite theologians, but the temptation is always power.
Yes.
Right? And so sometimes when people get access to that, they lose the corporate collective interest and become more enamored with the personal aggrandizement and interest. Right? And when that happens, then we begin to see the changes in the ebbs and flows and the rises and the falls. I think part of my role is to keep the collective interests of Christ before the people.
Yes.
Right? At no point do you find Christ concerned about himself.
Right.
And that doesn't speak to, so for those who say self-care is important, right? But, that's a different conversation. But to keep, this is not just about us. Our faith is not just for us to come and feel good, dump our personal problems, rub the belly of an idol God like a genie in a lamp and say, do this for me, hear my prayer, bless me, bless me, bless me. That is not what the cross was about,
Amen.
Right? And so I try and keep the center of the cross, where the vertical and the horizontal meet, before the eyes of the people in a way that they can see it, that they can grab hold to it, and they can decide how will they center and position themselves in that for the cause of the kingdom.
Yes. I can hear in what you've just said, the beginnings of a sermon or the movement toward an apex of an appeal, a prophetic appeal that you might be making. I want to say to the listeners that we're going to have the link to Allen Temple and to their sermons in the show notes here. So be sure and take advantage of that. But let me just use that vocal moment to say, what is the burden that you feel like you're primarily carrying? I mean, I often found in the decades that I was a pastor that I would sometimes feel a particular seasonal call based on, which didn't coordinate with natural seasons or with liturgical seasons necessarily, but with a season of feeling God had given me a particular way of seeing and holding the reality that I was trying to shepherd or influence or guide. A, do you have that? And B, if you do, how would you articulate that at the moment?
I'm sure you probably sensed this as well, because you were pastor of also a very active, prominent church within your denomination, the area, and I dare say the nation. My burden is always twofold, because Allen Temple is a national church.
Yes.
And there's always an expectation to speak to the issues, not just locally, but nationally.
Yes,
and so if we're speaking seasonally, I think the burden I feel is the burden kind of we all feel, which is what's going to happen next. Right. The vitriol, the hatred, the mischaracterizations, just the outright racism and sexism and all of those things by people who go to church.
Right.
On Sunday morning, they sit where we sit, right? And confess faith and how to keep people engaged in the process, how to help people understand that politics is not anti-biblical, nor is it anti-faith. And particularly in my context, helping people understand, even if you feel your voice is not heard, you have one. And it matters, right?
Right.
So just the burden of all of that, wishing that we could kind of do politics differently, wishing that I didn't have to stand and undo some kind of something that has been said that has really damaged a group of people, having to deal with young people who always begin their questions with, if God, right? If God is, fill in the blank, then why? Right? So that
exactly.
Conditional statement, that is the heaviness that I feel, because I also understand how those decisions impact what I drive past every day.
Right.
And how sometimes it can become more difficult than other times to really cast that vision after the alternative has been present for so long.
Right, so long.
Right. And so the election and all of those kitchen table issues, as they like to coin it, that are present for everybody, for my seniors who, need to get medication, but they don't live near a pharmacy and they don't drive. Right. Just all of those kinds of things, and trying to help people remain passionate about the things that they won't be directly impacted by. Right. That's always, I think, a burden that I carry, because it's easy to engage people who will feel it.
Yes.
But if you are not going to feel the consequences, right?
Right.
So it's a lot. It's a lot. But I suspect maybe that's true for all of us, maybe.
Right. I do think it must be interesting to be the female pastor of Allen Temple Baptist when the first time Oakland has a Black and Asian woman candidate from Oakland as its selected candidate. Talk to us about that. I mean, I've wondered about. I was
blessed to be invited to the DNC very last minute, and I went. Right. And so all of the exuberance and joy that people said they were feeling, you see it on television and you're like, yeah, okay, well, it was absolutely an amazing experience. Right. And just a testament and a story to what is possible. Sometimes I'm in those stadiums and I see people and I was like, why don't they feel this way about church? Like, we want to get them back in church.
Amen.
But just to even see, because sometimes I'm not sure even believers understand the power that exists in their sheer humanity. That there really is something that God has placed on the inside of us.
Yes. That
when we come to some form of collective agreement, not uniformity, but just some kind of collective unity around something, that really wonderful, great, powerful things can happen.
Yes.
It was an amazing experience. And really to see a candidate, just the turn and the shift in momentum, because politics was my undergraduate major. I have a thing for it, but a person and a candidate that they really said didn't stand a chance.
Right.
And just the shift has been really, just from a political connoisseur standpoint, it's just been amazing to watch, even at a distance. And so I am proud. Once again, that narrative, that Oakland narrative.
Yes.
It makes me proud. We can add it to the quilt of our story.
It was interesting to hear Oprah interview Kamala Harris the other day. And in that interview, as you know, she made something of this sense that many people have, that as Oprah represented it, it was like a veil somehow fell and a new Kamala stepped through, and we've never seen this much more full blooming Kamala in the way that is now being seen.
Yes.
And at a time when that is exactly the energy that the nation needs for the sake of a viable alternative. And so it was a very powerful thing. And I was in the context of a number of Black small groups that I was in, and some were just trying to give words to the significance of this and how differently it felt to them from Obama's nomination and that moment, which had its own exuberance and joy to it, absolutely. But A, that it was a woman. B, that it was at this moment in America's political life and history. And C, that she, as she then said in response to Oprah's question, there was just time to step up and and take on responsibility. And boy, has she stepped up and taken responsibility.
Yeah. And I do think it's a nod, if I could add a D. It was affirmation of a long line of women.
Yes, absolutely. Oh my gosh.
Paved the trail for her to be in that moment.
Yes.
And so I think what I appreciate about being there in person is that, yes, we were here for you to accept, for the nomination to be made and for you to accept this historic nomination. But they were very intentional about acknowledging that no one gets to this place alone. So there was a nod to the Shirley Chisholms. There was a nod to the Geraldine Ferreras, the Hillary Clintons, to the Elizabeth Warrens, to all of the women that we can name, and the countless women prior to those women who had stepped up. Right? When stepping up wasn't popular, when stepping up, you knew that it was not going to be well received. And so it felt like not just for a victory for us who were present, but just a historical victory, right? For all of the women of the suffrage movement and before who had sacrificed themselves for days that they would never see.
Right.
Yeah.
It's also been really interesting, and I think shrewd, but also just wise, that in her campaign, she's made relatively little of her gender or of her race, apart from what she's been sort of forced into having to engage. But apart from that, in her own being, those are not the things that she's principally talking about.
Not at all.
They're related. They overflow from that, but that is not the centerpiece. And it's partly because she's not making herself the centerpiece. It's really what you were saying, actually, of keeping the center about the center and
the needs of the people.
The needs of the people. And that rhetoric, which one would wish and hope is always at the core of what government is about, but often is not. So that's just been very moving to me.
Yes.
I know that there are listeners who may or may not see it the way we're talking about things. And I'm not suggesting that everybody that listens to this is a Kamala enthusiast or a Democrat or going to vote in a particular way. But I'm just acknowledging that for myself, it was enormously releasing to feel like there was actually a choice, and that the way that Kamala has handled herself was just continues to exceed expectations.
Continues to exceed. And to hear about the issues
that she's pointing
at that level that we, talk about. And to hear, to know that you are even cognizant. Right. I think that was also the power of the Oprah interview, that you actually dealt with real people. You centered the pain and the challenge of the people. And also at the same time did not mind being held to account. What will you do? Right? Because at the end of the day, regardless of what side you fall on, there's the belief that this person is going to help.
Yes.
Right. So I think that was important.
Yeah. Remarkable. So centering the pain around a center in Jesus Christ would be one way, I think, of summarizing my experience of your preaching, my experience of your leadership, and my experience today in this conversation. I do want to have you back because I think it would be very interesting to have a follow-up conversation, maybe on the other side of the election, a little further in to whatever the transition is that happens in the next year, and to continue to follow the story of Allen Temple and your own particular leadership. So for today, I just want to say, Jackie, I couldn't be happier to know you, as well as to be able to worship under your leadership and preaching, and to have you today as a guest on Conversing.
Thank you. The feeling is absolutely mutual, as you know. And so I'm honored to be here. And it was a wonderful conversation. I'd love to come back anytime you have me. And we certainly thank all of your listeners. I pray they were blessed as well.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Laberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.